And greetings to you. Joe Rubenstein here, producer and host of Real-Time 1960s. I want to thank you very much for joining me today for this portal into the past, where I document the 60s in real time with podcasts like this, with our evening news reports with audio clips and commercials of the day, as well as our daily timeline. And that timeline, along with each and every podcast, links to social media, how to reach us directly, it's all there for you on our website, realtime1960s.com. And if you love what we're doing and want even more content, visit patreon.com/realtime1960s, support this project, and get exclusive access to members-only posts and 3 additional monthly podcast series: White House Tapes, Special Report, and Films of the 60s. For more information on the benefits of supporting us through Patreon, visit patreon.com/realtime1960s. And today, we take the next step up my ranked list of the top 10 films of 1963. On 3 previous episodes, we covered films 10 through 8, From Russia with Love, This Sporting Life, and a documentary called Crisis, Behind a Presidential Commitment. And today, we move on to number 7. So without further ado, the Best of 63 at the Movies Part 4, right now. And today's film, The Great Escape, marked career turning points for a number of its leading players: Steve McQueen, James Garner, James Coburn. I'm tempted to add Charles Bronson to that list, but the truth is, he didn't really become a star until the 1970s, much to his everlasting bitterness. But simply put, this is a cast that only a year or 2 later could not have been assembled, as it would have been too expensive. Similar to The Godfather in that respect, but The Great Escape also marked not so much a turning point, but a career peak for its director, 53-year-old John Sturges, a man's man type figure in the mold of John Ford or Howard Hawks, who specialized in action films. But Sturges spent the entire 1950s trying to get this film about a mass escape from Stalag Luft III, a German POW camp, made. And finally, after 3 successful directorial efforts, the first of which is my personal favorite of his, Bad Day at Black Rock, released in 1955, and then Gunfight at the OK Corral, released in 57, and finally, The Magnificent Seven, released in 1960, Sturges finally got the green light on The Great Escape. And the success of The Magnificent Seven in particular was critical to gaining that approval, as it answered one of 2 major concerns that studio executives had about The Great Escape, which was, could a film without any major female characters succeed? And The Magnificent Seven, on the strength of a good screenplay based on Kurosawa's classic Seven Samurai, and the superabundant charisma of its large cast, 3 of whom, McQueen, Coburn, and Bronson, would resurface in The Great Escape, answered that question. It didn't actually do all that well here, but it was a smash hit in Europe, and, believe it or not, in the Soviet Union, probably due to the fact that the man who played the leader of the 7, Yul Brynner, was Russian-born and very popular there. Now, the other major concern about The Great Escape's commercial prospects was voiced by Sam Goldwyn, one of the original moguls. Sturges, who, as a captain in the U.S. Air Force's first motion picture unit, had filmed some critical events of World War II, had in 1951 come across the book The Great Escape by Paul Brickhill, one of the original POWs who had helped dig one of the 25-foot deep, 348-foot-long tunnels out of Stalag Luft III, which, considering the circumstances, was virtually a superhuman feat of engineering. Each tunnel had a track and trolley, an air pump, and lights spliced into the camp's electrical system, all of it constructed right under the noses of the German guards. But like the Charles Bronson character in the film, Danny, who was partially based on the author of the book, Brickhill had developed intense claustrophobia during his work on the tunnels, and so did not join the escapers, which may have saved his life. But Sturges was wild about the book, and thought it would make a hell of a picture. But when he pitched it to Sam Goldwyn in the early 50s, Goldwyn said, "What the hell kind of escape is that? Nobody gets away." Now, that wasn't entirely true. There were 3 who did make it to freedom. But to Goldwyn's point, all the others were rounded up. 50 were executed on direct orders from Adolf Hitler, and the rest were sent back to prison to await their liberation by Allied forces. General Patton was the first to reach the camp. But Sturges was a great admirer of perhaps the best POW film ever, Jean Renoir's Grand Illusion, released in 1937. And he also admired 2 other POW films released in the 50s, Stalag 17, which has not dated well, and The Bridge on the River Kwai, which has. But armed with the fact that these 3 films, all of which featured almost exclusively male casts, all of which had downbeat endings to varying degrees, had succeeded, Sturges never gave up. And with the leverage of the 3 successes I mentioned, he finally struck a deal with the Mirisch Company and United Artists, and in the summer of '62, gathered his large cast and crew in Bavaria, where, with the assistance of Wally Floody, a Canadian ex-POW who had designed and helped dig the original tunnels, Sturges was able to create an exact replica of the original prison camp and the tunnels, and shoot this film while navigating a number of difficulties, many of them generated by Steve McQueen, who, midway through the shoot, backed out because he felt his character, Virgil Hiltz, nicknamed the Cooler King because of all the time he spends in the cooler, the prison within the prison camp, was underwritten and lacked a distinctive profile. In the end, after a kind of carrot and stick routine from Sturges, McQueen was persuaded to rejoin the production. The stick was the threat that McQueen's role would be incorporated into James Garner's role, making Garner the star of the picture. McQueen, who was an insecure man in many ways, had a kind of competitive rivalry with Garner, so that stuck in his craw. The carrot was Sturges' offer to hire a writer, Ivan Moffat, whose only job would be to beef up McQueen's role. And this was done. And Moffat's additions to the screenplay resulted in some of the most memorable and iconic scenes in the film, including McQueen throwing a baseball against the cooler wall, McQueen getting manipulated by the British officers into serving as a scout for the tunnel operation, which gives McQueen a tinge of kind of reckless heroism. Also, the opening scene where McQueen rolls his baseball out to test a blind spot between the guard towers, that was new. But most importantly, the legendary motorcycle sequence in the final hour. Now, I covered this film from a Steve McQueen perspective in a podcast I did about the actor a couple of years ago, and there's a link to that episode in the show notes to this one. So having already covered the McQueen angle, and given the fact that this is probably the best known of all the films I'll cover this year, I thought I'd focus today on 5 points about this film that may be news to you, or, even if you know the film well, offer a fresh perspective. So let's get into it. Here are my top 5 facts about The Great Escape. Fact number 1. John Sturges had already proven with The Magnificent Seven his ability, first of all, to handle very large casts composed of competitive and sometimes difficult performers. But secondly, his knack for making a large cast of characters memorable to viewers. And he demonstrated these skills once again in The Great Escape. And his approach to the latter task was to present his many characters not as individuals, but in pairings. So instead of 14 major characters to remember, you just have 7 pairings to keep track of. So for example, Garner's character, the Scrounger, his job is to obtain or scrounge critical documents and various items needed by the escapers. Sturges paired the Scrounger with the Forger, played by Donald Pleasance, who had actually spent a year in a German POW camp himself, after having been shot down while serving with the Royal Air Force. So at the prison camp, Garner, this big strapping American, bunks with this bookish, bird-watching Forger, and kind of takes him under his wing, especially when it's revealed that Pleasance has severe myopia that should rule him out of the escape, but doesn't. Now, another pairing is the Tunnel King, played by Bronson, who, by the way, although he is saddled with a not-so-great Polish accent, he does manage to convey his character's fear and vulnerabilities quite well. Sturges was one of the only directors who saw and sought to exploit that aspect of Bronson's personality. Both here and in The Magnificent Seven, instead of presenting Bronson as the, indestructible He-Man, as he had been before and would be again in so many pictures, Sturges deliberately brought out the sensitive inner core, which resulted in two of Bronson's best performances. But the claustrophobic Tunnel King is paired off with a British flight lieutenant portrayed by John Layton, and similar to the Garner-Pleasance pairing, Layton helps Bronson through his disability as they're escaping. And finally, a third pairing is McQueen with the tiny Scottish actor Angus Lennie, who plays the Mole, an anxious and deeply homesick pilot who befriends McQueen in the cooler, and whose death sparks a critical change in the McQueen character, as after that death, a suicide really, McQueen transitions from the quintessential American loner to a team player, which is an old theme in Hollywood films, especially war films, the cynical individualist who eventually accepts a standard higher than self. Probably the most famous such character would be Rick Blaine, played by Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca. But Sturges approached the planning of this film almost as an engineer or an architect would. He plastered his office with maps, location photographs, and character note cards just to keep track of everything, and these pairings were very much a part of that planning and made what could have been an overwhelming task for the viewer, keeping track of all these characters, a pretty simple matter. Okay, fact number 2. The film's opening text reads as follows. Although the characters are composites, and time and place have been compressed, every detail of the escape is the way it really happened. So, this is not true. There are numerous deviations, which I will enumerate, but I would also add that these deviations from the hard facts, in my opinion, were well advised and actually enhanced the film, which is not a documentary, but a piece of Hollywood entertainment based on a real event. So the biggest divergence from reality, which was done to give the film a box office appeal not just in Britain but also in the US, was to include American POWs among the escapers. In fact, the American prisoners in Stalag Luft III were transferred to a different camp about a week before the planned breakout, and so were not part of the actual escape. However, Americans did participate in the planning and the digging of the tunnels, so it's not a total fabrication. Now, two elements in the film which follow the breakout are total fabrications. McQueen's commandeering of a motorcycle, and then his leading a bunch of Nazis on a chase through the hills of Bavaria, and then Garner's attempt to flee the Germans in an airplane with Pleasance as a passenger. Neither of these things happened. But the fact is, both the motorcycle chase and the abortive plane flight are extremely cinematic and very uplifting after 2 hours of confinement in that prison camp and then the tunnel. And as I said, the motorcycle chase in particular became the iconic sequence in this film. Now, there are other smaller details that are also untrue. The real escape took place during the dead of winter, an especially harsh winter, in fact. So one of the challenges the real escapers had to deal with on the night of March 24th, 1944, was the fact that the ground was frozen solid. So it took an hour and a half to defrost the exit hatch. But as I said, The Great Escape was filmed in the summer and fall, so that detail went out the window. But for the most part, the film is reasonably accurate. The dimensions of the tunnel, the dirt disposal method, the use of bedboards to firm up the tunnel walls, the fact that the original estimates were wrong and the tunnel was not dug long enough, so it did not reach the forest as intended, but popped up just a short distance from a sentry tower in open ground. The fact that not one but 3 tunnels, nicknamed Tom, Dick, and Harry, were dug, so if one were discovered, as it was, they would have alternatives. The slang terminology, for example, the German guards referred to as goons, the sentry platforms as goon boxes, that was accurate. The blackout, as they're tunneling out, that was caused by a nearby air raid. All these facts are portrayed faithfully in the film. And the fact is, most of the actual escapers who saw the film loved it, despite these few cinematic flourishes. So if it were up to me, I would have left out that opening text, because, well, first of all, it's not true, and secondly, it kind of set the filmmakers up for criticism. Okay, fact number 3. Something I've discovered, navigating the 60s day by day, as I have for 3 years now, is that the early 60s, the Kennedy years, were very much a distinct subset, with at least as much in common with the 50s as with the late 60s. So this film, released at the end of the Kennedy years, reflects that fact. It really has little, if anything, in common with the countercultural war films soon to follow. From Dr. Strangelove to The Dirty Dozen to MASH, all great films, but all with an air of skepticism or downright cynicism about America and American aims, and certainly about the military. Whereas here, there's none of that. The only resemblance to some of those later films might be the necessarily downbeat ending. But as I said, Sturges' earlier models also had downbeat endings. And actually, the ending here is less downbeat than you might think, as after the brief execution sequence, when McQueen is returned to the camp and sent to the cooler for the millionth time, he starts whipping that baseball against the wall over and over again, and it's clear that his spirit has not been broken in the least. So it's not exactly Cool Hand Luke, another prison film with a failed escape, the ending of which is just a complete wipeout. And there's certainly no sense of this being an anti-war film, as was Grand Illusion, released 26 years earlier. Of course, that was about World War I, where the moral lines were somewhat less clear. But more importantly, it was filmed during a period when the memory of that war was still fresh and very painful, and there was this sense that it should never happen again. But Sturges certainly had no misgivings about World War II or our role in it. As he later said, quote, "The film was about why our side won. Here were these guys who had never seen each other in their lives, all different nationalities, who formed an organization to escape. They're a microcosm of the Allies, men who voluntarily formed the most professional army ever put together to wipe out the Nazis. I saw it as a movie about this uncontrolled, individualistic, do-it-your-way form of life, our way of life, which defeated those dictatorial sons of bitches," unquote. Of course, to achieve that victory, we had to align ourselves with the dictatorial son of a bitch, Joseph Stalin. But, sometimes things work out that way. But Sturges, as I said, was a World War II veteran, as were many others in the cast. Garner was a decorated veteran of the Korean War. McQueen had served in the Marines, but was fortunate to have been honorably discharged just before the Korean War broke out. But he was very proud of his service and would remain so. So these guys' view of the war and of America were pretty much aligned with the prevailing viewpoint held in the post-war era in this country, up to and including the early 60s. Predominantly positive. But that's a viewpoint that would soon find itself under siege, and remains so, to some extent, to this day. Okay, moving on to fact number 4. Unsurprisingly, given the wealth of characters, the rough cut of this film was very long, 5 hours in fact. So obviously, to pare that down to releasable length, which was ultimately 2 hours 52 minutes, Sturges had to cut, a third of the film. And since all of the cut footage was apparently destroyed, there are no deleted scenes available for viewing. So I thought for this 4th fact, I'd fill in some of the gaps and tell you a few things that were left on the cutting room floor. And Sturges, by the way, who died in 1992, said late in life that he was not a fan of director's cuts that reincorporate cut material. He said even if the earlier deletions from this film could be found, he would not be in favor of restoring them. And I actually agree with that general view of director's cuts with 2 large exceptions. The first is Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in America. That's a masterpiece that was absolutely butchered by the studio when it was released. They rearranged the flashback structure and presented it in chronological order, and then cut out tons of critical material. So that restoration, which was spearheaded by Martin Scorsese, was a great gift to cinephiles everywhere, as was the expanded version of Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch, which restored backstory that was lifted by the studios for the second American release in 1969 to allow more screenings. But those are the exceptions that prove the rule. For the most part, restored scenes should not have been, in my opinion. But scenes cut from this film include an early failed escape by McQueen and the mole, which is referenced in the final film but not shown. There was also a montage inside the cooler that showed McQueen passing time in various ways. There was a near capture of Bronson and Layton in a rowboat after the breakout. And then there was a scene with Coburn that Sturges hated to lose. Coburn's character, an Australian nicknamed the Manufacturer, his job is to construct tools for the escape, including the ingenious ventilation apparatus. So on the night of the escape, Coburn insists on leaving the camp with a large suitcase, the only one of the escapers to do so, which puzzles his comrades and puzzles the audience because it's never revealed in the final cut what's inside that suitcase. But you did find out originally. In the rough cut, as Coburn is making his way towards Spain and freedom, he stops by a little stream and opens the suitcase. And inside, next to a change of clothes, is some cheese, a bottle of wine, and a book. So, in the middle of this daring escape, Coburn sits down by this stream, nibbles on the cheese, takes a few sips of wine, and reads his book, which got a big laugh from the preview audience, but had to go for the sake of length. A lot of these scenes were sacrificed for the sake of McQueen's motorcycle antics. Now, there was actually one scene they cut that they had to put back. The scene where a character called the Tailor shows the Big X, the leader of the breakout, played by Richard Attenborough, these civilian clothes that he's constructed from blankets and stolen uniforms. It's not the most riveting scene, but without it, preview audiences in 1963 were mystified as to how the escapers obtained civilian clothes. So that scene was put back and remains in the film. Okay, our final fact for the day, more of an opinion actually, which is while this film may not have the depth or the artistry of some of the others on my list for 63, there are three elements that I think lift The Great Escape into the realm of, if not greatness, then very goodness. Number one, excellent casting. Number two, Sturges' handling of the storytelling structure. And number three, yet another first-class musical score by Elmer Bernstein, who had just delivered one of the greatest scores ever the year before for To Kill a Mockingbird. So just to touch very briefly on these three elements. First, the casting. It's a great mix to have all these top-notch British actors with these all-American stars, or stars in the making. Richard Attenborough later said that he sensed at the time that the Americans expected him and the other British actors to be a bit snobbish, because, there was this general sense in the US, really everywhere, that British actors were the best in the world, proficient in Shakespeare and all the rest. But Attenborough said that actually, since Marlon Brando burst onto the film scene in the 50s and gave it this massive jolt of raw energy, he and most of his peers felt that the American film scene was way ahead of the British, as it was more visceral, and British films were felt to be too talky and less realistic. So it came as a pleasant surprise to the American actors on The Great Escape that their British counterparts were every bit as much in awe of them as they were of the Brits. Now, as for the storytelling structure, that was a major effort, because the book The Great Escape has no real structure, presenting over 60 men whose characters are not really delineated except in the most rudimentary way. So Sturges, with the help of his screenwriters, primarily James Clavell, who had himself spent a harrowing 3 years in a Japanese POW camp during World War II. But Sturges and Clavell came up with the character pairings I mentioned, but also a 3-act structure. The first act is the introduction of the camp, the command structure, and the 15 primary escapers that we will get to know. The second act is transitional, events that lead directly to the escape. And finally, the third act is the escape itself and all that happens outside the walls, and then there's a denouement back at the prison. So from a very complex historical event involving a multitude of players, Sturges and Clavel crafted a script that really functions like a well-oiled machine. And if there's one distinctive virtue of Sturges' films, it's that he's a really good storyteller. And then finally, the musical score, the most famous element of which is the main theme, which definitely recalls the main theme from The Bridge on the River Kwai, except Bernstein gives his theme a very American fife and drum treatment with a bit of tuba as a comical touch. And this theme has a kind of devil-may-care, up-yours quality that perfectly matches the defiant courage of the prisoners. But at other times, during nighttime scenes at the camp, and then in some of the scenes in the Bavarian countryside, Bernstein gives you these almost Brahmsian symphonic touches that give those scenes an air of profundity. But that main fife and drum theme, which was actually a recycling of a military composition Bernstein had written when he was 14 years old, is extremely catchy and became a hit on both sides of the Atlantic when Mitch Miller recorded it as a single called The Great Escape March. And Bernstein later said that when he conducted concerts of his music in Britain, the audience would always whistle along when he did that number, which is kind of cool. Now, one final note. I think beyond the technical elements I just described, there's something universal that speaks to us, or to me anyway, about prison escape films. Even ones where actual criminals, not just war combatants, are escaping. I think everyone at some point has something they want to escape, whether it's a home environment, a work environment, a relationship, a state, whether geographical or psychological. You know, life is full of traps and prisons. So the dramatic rendering of escape, I've always found especially engaging in a visceral way. And with the right cast and a firm directorial touch, films like this one, I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, Grand Illusion certainly, Cool Hand Luke, Papillon, which also features McQueen, Escape from Alcatraz, and Shawshank Redemption, those are probably my favorites. I think these films offer a uniquely thrilling ride, while also shining a light on human resilience, ingenuity, and our inherent desire for freedom. So check it out, my 7th ranked film for 1963, The Great Escape. Back in a moment. Your feedback is important to us. On Twitter, @Realtime1960s, on our Facebook page, or you can email the program, realtime1960s@gmail.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. And if you'd like to join our family and help us continue to bring you great content, please go to patreon.com/realtime1960s and subscribe. Don't forget to visit us at realtime1960s.com for our timeline, each and every podcast, links to social media, how to reach us directly, everything you need to know about this portal into the past that we are creating. Thanks so much for joining us, and stay tuned for the next installment of this ongoing series covering the top 10 films of 1963. So take care, and I'll see you soon.